Hey guys and girls, today I'm going to cover the Chapter 21, Section 3 notes, the 1920s conflicts about American ideals. We're going to cover two major key concepts. 721D in the 1920s, cultural and political controversies emerged as Americans debated gender roles, modernism, science, religion, and issues related to race and immigration. And 722A, immigration from Europe reached its peak in the years before World War I. Nativist campaigns against some ethnic groups led to the passage of quotas that restricted immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, and increased barriers to Asian immigration. So I broke Section 3 into a couple categories. We'll first talk about the new Klan, then we'll get to anti-immigration sentiments, the beginning of the Farmers' Depression, and end with religious fundamentalism versus science. So let's start with the new Klan. So the KKK was revived as a defender of prohibition, opponents of immigration, rights for African Americans, and anything that undermined the dominance of white, native-born Protestants. In 1915, Georgian William Joseph Simmons recreated the Klan. In the early 1920s, a Texan, Hiram Leslie Evans, pushed Simmons aside and turned the Klan into a hugely successful hate organization aimed at African Americans, immigrants, Catholics, Jews, and anyone violating prohibition laws. The model for the new Klan became one flag, one school, one Bible. They advocated a Department of Education that would ensure that all American children were taught Klan-defined patriotism. They still had their old agenda, of course, maintaining racial segregation by using terror if need be. The new Klan also increasingly attacked Catholic and Jews for what they perceived as their foreign influence. To counter that, groups like the Catholic Knights of Columbus or the American Unity League began to challenge the Klan and spoke of true Americanism. The most effective anti-Klan tactic, however, was simply to find and publicize the list of its members. Between these counters, opposition to the Klan, battle amongst its leaders, and eternal corruption all weakened the organization, and by 1930, membership dropped to around 50,000. Of course, the Klan still exists today, but very, very low membership. All right, let's get to anti-immigration sentiment. In 1924, congressional opponents of immigration succeeded in cutting virtually all immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. Labor unions and some African American organizations feared that immigrants could depress wages or take jobs. You had supporters of the eugenics movement that also worried the traditional Anglo-American culture was being diluted. Because of all these fears, in 1917, Congress passed a literacy test for new immigrants over President Wilson's objection and veto, though most immigrants were in fact illiterate, so it didn't really stop immigrants from coming. In 1921, they passed the Immigration Restriction Act, which set quotas for the number of immigrants who could enter, mainly out of fear that Poland's Jewish ghettos were about to empty into the United States after World War I. Anti-immigrant Congressman Albert Johnson, who strongly believed that eugenics and IQ tests proved that Asians, as well as Southern and Eastern Europeans, were inferior people, became chair of the House Committee on Immigration. So he was going to set the congressional policy then for immigration. In setting this new quota for the number of immigrants, Johnson instead used the 1890 census instead of the most recent 1910 census. This is key because the 1910 census was taken just before the second wave of immigration, limiting the percentage of immigrants allowed into the country to 2% of that number. It also completely banned all Japanese immigration. Johnson's new 1924 Immigration Restriction Act passed by the wide margins, and President Calvin Coolidge signed it into law. Immigration from most of Europe and all of Asia and Africa was severely limited until 1965. Also did not stop immigration like Irish immigrants, nor did it set quotas for immigrants from North or South America, mainly targeting just Southern and Eastern Europeans and Asian immigrants. Oops, sorry about that. Let's move on to I must not have included this in the point. All right, so we'll wrap up here with religious fundamentalism. The prosperity of the 1920s drove many social changes, including high schools that began springing up in small towns and rural communities, By 1890, a total of 200,000 American youth were enrolled. By 1920, that number grew to 2 million. So you have a huge growth in public high schools. With the growth of high schools, some Americans worried about what was being taught, particularly in high school biology classes. Biology classes were greatly influenced at the time by Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and his theory of evolution. Darwin's book was controversial, and particularly in terms of its theological implications. Popular religion was also evolving. Before 1900, most Protestants assumed the Bible was a fairly accurate historical record. But this new higher criticism of the Bible sought to understand it in terms of the social context in which it was written. In response to all this, the rise of theory of evolution and these new religious thoughts, a new movement known as fundamentalism began within the American Protestantism. Fundamentalists called for a literal reading of the Bible. They rejected any other interpretations. They had a more pessimistic view of modern society. They saw the U.S. in 1920 as sinful, openly flouting prohibition laws, questioning moral standards. They were concerned with the growth of Catholic and Jewish immigrants, and, of course, the teaching of evolution in schools. So in 1925, in Dayton, Tennessee, high school biology teacher John Thomas Scopes, with support of the American Civil Liberties Union, is going to violate Tennessee state law by teaching evolution. The whole thing was set up because they wanted to challenge the state law and hopefully get it to the Supreme Court, because they believed it violated free speech laws. So Clarence Darrow, the best-known lawyer in the country at the time, volunteered to join the ACLU team to represent Scopes. William Jennings Bryan was, of course, we talked about him, former anti-imperialist candidate, Vice President to Woodrow Wilson. He's going to actually volunteer to be the prosecutor. And this was a countrywide event. Every paper around, all the major papers around the country came to cover the trial. Most people agreed during the trial that Darrow got the better of Jennings Bryan. But on the facts, Scope was clearly guilty, which they all knew going in, and fined $100. The Tennessee Supreme Court actually ended up throwing the case out on a technicality. They did this on purpose to avoid an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was the intended goal in the first place by Scopes and the ACLU. So he was found guilty, fined, but got thrown out ultimately. And unfortunately for William Jennings Bryan, he actually dies about a week after the trial. But that is all for now. I moved the problems about the farmer depression into the next section as we get into closer to the Great Depression. So we'll talk about that then, and I'll see you guys next time.